Thank you for joining for today's Sustainability Leadership Presentation Series with Dr. Layla Nadir discussing healing industrial amnesia, how art can help us remediate our environmental memory disorder. The SLPS is brought to you by UNO Center for Urban Sustainability, Central Community College, Joslin Institute for Sustainable Communities, Metropolitan Community College, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and WasteTap, Nebraska. Throughout the presentation, please use hashtag SLPSThursday on Twitter or the chat box via WebEx. Questions will be answered during the Q&A at the end. Layla Nadir is an acclaimed Afghan-American artist and writer investigating evolutions of food, ecology, media, and memory. She is currently lecturer in environmental humanities and sustainability at the University of Rochester and former Andrew Mellon postdoctoral fellow in environmental humanities at Wellesley College. She earned her PhD in English from Columbia University. Her creative practice involves the production of participatory public situations and social sculptures that facilitate recovery from a cultural memory disorder that she and her collaborator call industrial amnesia.
Hi, everybody. The first thing I want to do today is show you a video that my collaborator and I have created. His name is Kerry Peppermint, and he's a new media artist, so we do a lot of work together. And before you're told how to watch the video on your own, I wanted to give just a little bit more information about myself and how I ended up working on environmental issues from an art perspective. I was trained as a literary scholar, so I do a lot of work where I analyze and read literature and poetry, but I also feel that there is a lot of work with the imagination that needs to be done regarding the environment that can't be done just with making arguments or doing scholarship or even through science. So today I'm going to try to introduce you to what art has to bring to our imagination of the environment, to our understandings of the environment, and how we perceive it. So first off, I'm going to have you watch a video, and I'm going to give you a little information about the video first. The video is about the contrast between industrial infrastructure and trying to do things alternatively or sustainably or DIY, do it yourself. With primitive technologies. And so you'll see scenes of movement on highway, shipping of food. A lot of this has to do with food for me. You'll see military bases where there's a suggestion that the military-industrial complex is part of our food production, part of our environmental experience. You'll see factories, oil drilling, gas stations, landscapes of fast food. And by the way, I should mention that I did a lot of the research behind this video while I was doing an art residency in Omaha. So a lot of the images that you're seeing are actually in Nebraska, specifically in Omaha. And then on the other side of the video, in the contrast, you'll also see more remote, sustainable practices like washing clothes by hand, burning brush in a forest to make a garden, trying to bake with a solar oven, trying to harvest spring water in the middle of the woods in the state of Maine, camping. So as you watch it, I want you to think about what this contrast and what these oppositions do for you. How do they make you feel? How do you receive them? And how is this different than a scientific approach to environmental issues? That was a video called Ecologies of Inconvenience. And the reason I wanted you to see it immediately from the beginning is that a lot of people assume that the arts and even the humanities in general, that their role in environmental issues is to communicate the solutions that scientists discover. And my approach to art, and a lot of artists when we work on the environment, is not to just communicate science, but to ask the questions that science doesn't ask. And hold on, I'm having trouble moving through this. Oh, there we go. So a couple of the ideas I want to put in your minds from the beginning here is, what questions about the environment and sustainability do we forget to ask when we let science and industry ask all the questions for us? And I also want to introduce the idea that art asks the questions that we didn't know needed to be asked, and that art doesn't seek solutions. It can create instead happenings, experiences, and we gain insight through that process that we wouldn't necessarily get through facts and figures. So this video, Ecologies of Inconvenience, for me as an artist, it raises the question of, how do we live sustainably? We constantly are being forced to work within an industrial system, to go to supermarkets, to drive on highways, to use the oil that is being drilled, to depend on the military to protect our access to oil, to rely on industrial agriculture when even if we don't want to, we usually end up sometimes using industrial agriculture in our food supply. And we're constantly in that position and yet being told to live sustainably. So what my collaborator and I do is we experiment with sustainable DIY, off-the-grid practices. And a lot of the images you saw of the more primitive practices are all taking place in off-grid, solar-powered, rainwater catchment dwellings where we really are living sustainably, but we're always in this push and pull and in this tension between the industrial and the sustainable. And this is a question that we think needs to be talked about and a question that needs to be asked. And it usually gets covered over and buried when we start talking just about how to reduce carbon emissions. Well, maybe we should also be talking about the difficulties we have doing that and the way that our lives pull us in different directions all the time. And so this is a way that I want to start thinking about art in the humanities and its role in sustainability. So a couple of quotes I want to start you with before I show you another one of my works. This is a quote by an environmental philosopher from Eugene, Oregon. And he does a really good job of explaining how arts in the humanities environmentally are different than scientific approaches. And he says, the concern of environmental arts and humanities is not with gathering facts, but rather with the assumptions that frame what counts as fact. So when we talk about environmental problems, environmental issues, how did those get defined? How did we get there? Let's talk about the issue and how we define it before we just start solving it. The humanities are concerned with meanings and values of which facts are only one subset, and which require the specific skills of interpretation, clarification, evaluation, and judgment. So for me, art and humanities, especially arts for me and the way I practice it, tries to look deeply beyond the facts and look at how do we live our lives? Why do we live them the way we do? What are the questions we have that we don't ever get answered? What about the questions that are unanswerable? Like the fact that we try to live sustainably and we try to solve the environmental crisis, but we all are still dependent upon an industrial infrastructure that is not so good for the planet. So a couple more quotes. One is the next one I want to show you is by a French philosopher, Félix Guattari, and he pointed out that when you are trying to save the planet, in a way, you're also trying to save the imagination. And his quote says, "It's not just species that are becoming extinct, but also words, phrases, and gestures." And a way to think about this quotation is that we're often taught about species going extinct, plants, animals, and those are so important. But at the same time, what happens to certain forms of relating to those plants and relating to those animals? Do we lose a part of ourselves as humans when we lose a species? Do we lose gestures? Do we lose phrases as we become more and more online or more attached to digital devices? So how is our imagination connected to the planet in so many ways that our minds are not independent from the earth that we're living on? And one last quote I want to talk to you about is by Thoreau, probably the most famous environmental thinker in the United States. And Thoreau said something similar to the French philosopher that I just quoted. He said, we're accustomed, and he's talking about 19th century in New England, and he's observing nature, and he's noticing that the passenger pigeon, which I have pictured here, is going extinct. He says, we're accustomed to saying in New England that few and fewer pigeons visit us every year. Our forests furnish no mast for them, so it would seem few and fewer thoughts visit us, each growing, I think I left out a word, but fewer and fewer thoughts visit each growing man year to year. So he's again talking about that when the pigeons go extinct, when the environment changes in such a drastic way, our minds change. Like when we lose a species, do we lose a thought at the same time? So environmental art is very much about imagination and how that's connected to ecological crises. So what I want to show you now is a performance I did in Omaha at an art center called Bemis Center for the Arts. It's actually a very highly respected art institution across the U.S. and maybe the world. And Bemis supported a project of mine called Edible Ecologies. And what Edible Ecologies is, and I've defined it here for you, it's a series of social sculptures, which means using society as your artistic medium. Instead of using clay or paint, you're using social interactions. So it's a series of social sculptures or social interventions working collaboratively with local communities, human communities, bacterial, ecological communities, to resuscitate endangered food practices and remediate a cultural memory disorder that my collaborator and I call industrial amnesia. So if you think about the quotes I just showed you, that as the planet changes, as our society changes, our minds and our memories and our imagination change, and our understanding of the environment transforms, this project is very much about, can we try to remember what happened before our planet was industrialized? Have we forgotten? And if we had, isn't this a cultural memory disorder, and it's something that we should try to fix or remediate so that we can remember what came before today, because it might help us tomorrow. So here's some pictures of the project. It was called Edible Ecologies OS Fermentation Workshop. And there was 3 parts to it. The first was a reading and a discussion group. So this is me leading a discussion with Omaha residents, some beyond Omaha. Some people drove 1 to 2 hours because I heard about this event on NPR. I was pretty impressed. And we're reading an article about fermentation and about microbiology. And you might be asking, what does that have to do with the environment? What does fermentation and microbes or food have to do with the environment? And everything we eat, everything we put in our bodies is coming from the earth, and how it's grown, how it's processed, how it's treated reflects an environmental ethic. It also reflects whether we've used sustainable practices or not. And microbiology is a new area of study that is actually connecting the human body to the environment. I'm not sure if any of you have seen any of the big articles that have come out in the last couple of years about how there are trillions of bacteria in all of our intestines that are helping digest the food we eat, and that these bacteria are actually, we're so dependent upon them that you can't really think of the human body as an individual, but rather as a superorganism. So if we think of ourselves instead of as individuals, but as superorganisms, you start to already see this ecological network right in our own bodies. And one of what we're trying to do with this project, OS Fermentation, is to create an awareness of that. What happens when you start to think of yourself as connected with trillions of other beings on Earth and not just as this independent individual? So after the reading group, 2 weeks passed, and we reconvened with the participants in Omaha, and now we have all read and understood basics of microbiology and basics of fermentation. We got together and fermented food. Now, this is a really huge environmental experience for so many participants and for me. This workshop was a moment where a lot of people put their hands in food for the first time. There's so many different things happening. In many ways, it's spiritual because you're sort of interacting with death and decomposition. Fermentation is actually the suspension of life, or a suspension of biological material between life and death. So the cabbages that we ferment, they're not dead and they're not alive. They're put in the suspended state with the assistance of microbes that digest them. And so it's also an act of public health. When your vegetables are pre-digested by bacteria, they're actually more nutrient bioavailable. And by that I mean that the structure of the vegetables has broken down so that you actually absorb more healthful nutrients from the food. So it's also an awareness of how do microbes collaborate with us. And this is, again, an environmental experience because this becomes an interspecies collaboration. Humanity, at least in the modern world, we've become so detached from working with other animals, with other species, with collaborating and creating healthy environments for others besides humans. And this is a moment where in their jars, participants are creating an environment to grow bacteria. So it also is an act of interacting with biodiversity, growing bacteria, interacting with bacteria, and then eventually eating them. This is also an act of very slow food. Bacteria are actually cooking the vegetables. Fermentation originally etymologically means to boil. So it's a very slow boil. That's why you get bubbling and the breakdown of nutrients. But at the same time, it remains raw. I should also mention, this is the person you're seeing at the front of this photo is my partner, Carrie Peppermint, who I collaborate with. And I usually am in charge of teaching people how to ferment vegetables, but he loves to drink. And he is usually in charge of teaching people how to make wine and drink and how to make alcoholic beverages very, very quickly. So 2 weeks later, the cooking process is done. This is about the slowest food movement you'll ever see. Very much bacteria slows down the cooking process. If it takes 2 weeks to get your food cooked, it's definitely a process that slows you down, makes you mindful, aware of your connections to other species and your connections to your health, public health. So 2 weeks later, again, this is again in Omaha at the Bemis Center for Contemporary Art, we reconvened again, and this time we ate a dinner together. And everybody brought their fermentations. And I have to admit, as an artist, I was very nervous about whether people's fermentations would work. I've done these workshops a lot, and sometimes you get some mold, sometimes people fail at this, they didn't take care of their ferment. You have to keep your eye on it, you need to take care of it a little bit. But amazingly, Omaha's workshop was probably the most successful I ever had, and maybe that's because everybody knew they're coming back for a dinner, so they really wanted to be impressive. So this is everyone returning, and they've brought back their vegetable ferments, that's in the large jars that you saw, and they've brought back their little jars of wine, which we made with honey. And then we had catered bread and some spreads. And by the way, all the spreads were coming from a very famous vegan cook in Omaha named Isa Moskowitz. And she provided all the spreads and the bread. And everyone shared their meal. Now, this is a pretty amazing experience for a lot of people. Again, a lot of environmental issues people believe is because of a lack of collaboration, a lack of community between people, a lack of awareness of other species and our reliance on them and our intercommunion with them. And so this dinner was a moment for everyone to share their microbes, share their vegetables, share their foods, and also talk. And it was a moment when people who had never known each other before were suddenly talking, sharing each other's ferments. It was really a quite amazing experience. It was really a lot of fun. So there's so much happening in this. In addition to just the good time everybody had, There's also the element of accepting the messiness and the wildness and the ecological systems into your diet. Industrial food tends to be dead. It tends to be sanitized, frozen, pasteurized, radiated, and this is food that is literally teeming with trillions of bacteria, and we're eating it and having a great time. So it's like a little mini environmental movement in the form of a collaborative dinner. So in some ways, it's also a very healing ritual. I mean, it heals your digestive system, it heals environmental disconnection, and it heals sort of cultural isolation, people not collaborating and talking to each other enough in our culture. So it also makes, in some ways, new networks of mini practices that could begin to change the world in a way that perhaps science, industry, and entertainment can't. So I want to leave you with these questions again that I began with, which is, what are the questions that we forget to ask when we let science and industry ask all the questions for us? And what are the questions that are asked that we didn't know needed to be asked? And if we do have time for Q&A today, which I think we will, I'd love to know what questions came up for you today that you had never thought about before in the context of other environmental discussions. My third point, art doesn't have to seek solutions. So solutions are important, but when we get preoccupied with solutions, sometimes we forget about the process along the way, or we forget what doesn't fit into the model of solutions. So art can create happenings and experiences as well. And that insight comes from the process of experiencing new things, experiencing new environments, new situations. And lastly, I want to say that for me, art is an urgent and necessary intervention between utility and imagination. So for me, it's very important to find solutions, to find utilitarian results that actually change people's lives. But I want at the same time not to shut down imagination. How does creating fermentation provide a useful product, but at the same time change your entire worldview of microbes and other species and ecological messiness and networks and ecosystems and public health and slow food? There's so many things at play and so many discussions to be had at the same time that we actually have a useful product at the end of the art experience. So this is what the questions I'm going to leave you with today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have about this process. A lot of times the most powerful parts of my talks are the Q&A. So thank you so much for listening. I think I saw there was 17 of you out there. I imagined you all while I was speaking, and I hope we can discuss more. And if we don't talk more today, I'd be happy to, if you reach out over email or over social media, I'd be happy to talk some more. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Layla. So just a reminder, we're going to give everybody a chance to ask some questions. So Layla, I'll read them to you as they come in. And then as a reminder to the people watching, you can put your questions in the chat box. You can give your questions to your room host if you're in a live room, or you can ask on Twitter via hashtag SLPS Thursday. So while everybody's doing that, I do have a couple of questions. So do you feel that if people connect more with their food, they will appreciate the land and the food process and the environment as a whole more?
I think so. That's been my experience. The more I learn about food, the more I've figured out where it's coming from, what's going into it, how it's grown, how animals are treated in factory farms. And as I did that, I started caring about it going into my body. And I also started realizing that when I watched more what I was eating and ate more healthy, I felt better. I had more energy. And I just felt good about my decisions. I felt good that I wasn't eating food that was being sprayed with chemicals that hurt other animals or that destroy ecosystems. And I think that's part of the power of people finding out this information for yourself, but also finding out through an experience like the images I just showed you, everyone coming together and eating together, it's sort of amazing, but that's a somewhat rare experience at this point in history, and that's part of the industrial amnesia that my work is trying to remediate. That in industrialization, we're also on the go so much. We get fast food through drive-thrus. We eat food as fuel to just get through the day. And what happens when you really, really slow down? And when you slow down, you start looking around, you start listening, you start being more mindful. And I think a lot of times a big obstacle to environmental issues and environmental ethics is just the fact that nobody has time. So I think time lets you start opening your imagination and start asking questions.
One question we had is, how did you develop this interest in eco-ecology?
Wow. So I've always been, since I grew up in the countryside, and then I was always, in my youth, a backpacker and going into the woods, and then I'd come back into the city and do my work. And it took me a while to realize that this could be my work. Nature and the environment were just an escape for me and a way to rest, a refuge from the fast-pacedness and the non-healingness of a lot of the productivity we're all involved in. And I slowly started to realize, wow, I want to think more about these issues. So I was in graduate school studying literature, and I got more and more interested in environmental literature. I started working with my collaborator, who's a new media artist, and he wasn't doing anything on the environment, but he started asking environmental questions, and we just slowly sort of developed a really serious approach to let's start doing experiments with environmental experiences. What if we, make these events and invite people to experience what we've experienced? And I actually realized that a talent of mine, and this is a weird talent, I don't know how you list this on a resume, a talent of mine was creating communities. I ended up, realizing that I'd like to bring people together and help them experience things that they wouldn't normally experience. So it's hard to explain, how do you end up doing anything? But I would say that I just kept following a passion, and I kept being interested in it. I kept pushing it until eventually it started turning into a profession that I sort of created and invented.
That's awesome. So then another question we have is, if the younger generation is not experiencing plants and animals that are now extinct, do you think they have less of an imagination than the older generation, or is it based on your personal experiences to seek out nature?
I'm not sure. I definitely think not having access to nature is a little bit, that scares me, but I don't think it has to be in the form of great big wilderness woods. I mean, I'm from New England, so that's our model of nature, is big woods and trees in the middle of the mountains. But it doesn't have to happen that way. I live right now in a small city in Rochester, New York, and I'm working on creating urban farms and promoting urban farms in this city so that people have nature in their backyards. Even though people are living in the street, they're, stomping on the sidewalks, maybe a few blocks away there's a garden with lettuce and kale and carrots, so that they can have that chance to weed a garden and put their hands in dirt. And I do think that that bodily experience can't be denied. I think that I think without that, environmental issues can be very abstract. And until you start to feel the energy of that kind of work, sometimes it just doesn't become concrete, and maybe it can't create a passion. So, yeah, I do worry. I hear that younger generations are inside more, looking at screens, and that does worry me. But I hope that we can also create little nature refuges in everyday life, that we don't have to drive hours and hours to a special location, but maybe on our block in the city, we could have a little garden where bees are attracted and hummingbirds and flowers and food we can eat. And I think that's a pretty radical act.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Thank you. Another question is, do you have any tips for taking less of a science approach for people? And maybe how do we encourage more of an arts or humanities approach to the environment?
I definitely think science dominates. I just had a student the other day said that she's waiting for a technology that's going to solve climate change, and I thought, technology got us into a lot of those problems. I don't know if it's going to get us out. I would say the way any sort of curiosity begins is starting to look around, eat up any resources you can find, start reading literature, just do searches online for people who are teaching environmental art, environmental literature, and just start following the paths that you get. There's a lot of books being published about environmental art, books about environmental literature. If you go to libraries, you can talk to librarians and get those out. And even if you don't read the book front to back, you can skim through and find titles of novels, titles of essays, films. There's so many films now dealing with environmental issues, and a lot are scientific, but a lot also are about the imagination and about thinking about what science can't answer. Science is important, but I think it's really important for arts and humanities to always be pushing against science and say, like, did you think about this? Have you thought about this? Can we solve things, scientifically or technologically with this top-down approach where we provide, scientists provide the solution for the rest of all people? Or is there something that people can do from the ground up? And urban farming is one example of this. That right there is a sort of creative practice where it's not following like some big scientific truth, but it's saying, hey, I found a vacant lot. I'm going to do something creative with it. I'm going to do something healing with it, something for my community. So you don't even have to look for proper art or proper literature or proper films. You could just start thinking about what can you do creatively on a ground level, on a base level, like on your block, to start to inspire environmental experiences and creativity and mindfulness about the world around us.
So do you have any personal favorites of environmental literature or films that you would recommend?
Let's see. I teach a course on environmental literature right now, and we read a lot of interesting people. We read Toni Morrison, her book Song of Solomon. It's a really beautiful work about an African-American guy who lives in Chicago, and his family's history is in the rural South, and they had all left the South to escape violence. And it's a lot about how when they escaped that violence and came north, how they lost those agricultural roots, how his family's rural history was lost. And so he goes back down south to try to reconnect to where his people came from. And that's a beautiful, beautiful novel about that process. Another favorite novel of mine is Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony. She's a Native American writer who writes about a guy who comes home from the Korean War or World War II, I forget which, and his reservation is being mined for uranium to create nuclear bombs. So it's a lot about him contending with all the issues of his Native American history, his people losing their land, but at the same time, now their land is sort of still being lost because it's being mined for uranium to create bombs. So it's a lot about how do you deal with that so much violence and such a traumatic history. So a lot of environmental work that I like is about healing from some of the loss of land, some of the trauma of violence, of environmental destruction. Another beautiful work that I teach is a work by Jamaica Kincaid called A Small Place. And in that very short little novella, she writes about Antigua in the tourism business where people go to Antigua for vacation. and she writes all about the real injustice and inequality of the ecotourism business, that as privileged people from the West go down and use the beaches and have these beautiful hotels, that the locals who actually are from the island and live on the island can't access the beach, and they don't have running water, and they don't have any of those luxuries that the tourists have. So that's another work that's about, let's think about the injustice of certain forms of environmental experiences. So I guess I'm very attracted to works that deal with race and class and gender and get us out of just, let's solve the environmental crisis from a scientific perspective, but rather, how is the environment part of a very sordid history that we tend not to think about, that a lot of people have to contend with these traumas that are environmental, and what can we learn from that? Because we're all probably facing a trauma in the next few generations of climate change.
Thank you. We'll have to check out some of those. Great. And then our last question is, do you think that fermenting uses more of like the ugly or misshapen food that is often thrown out, and then in turn kind of reduces the food waste issue that we have going on?
I hope so. I mean, you can ferment anything, so it doesn't have to use the ugly, misshapen food that's thrown out, but I would hope that everyone is just using those sorts of food in general. So I think that possibly people who are doing fermentation on a commercial level probably throw the uglier stuff in there because it gets cut up and grated and even looks more beautiful when it's fermented because the colors come out in a more bright way. So I don't know if that's actually a practice or not, but it's definitely something you can do with stuff that doesn't look so attractive. Because yeah, food waste is a serious issue. I think something like 25% to 40% of all food that's produced and purchased in the U.S. ends up being thrown out. So I'm glad that you're thinking about that issue and connecting it to fermentation and art.
Great, thank you. So it looks like that is all the questions we have for today. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And then our next presentation will be December 1st, and that's hosted by the University of Nebraska Lincoln Environmental Studies Program, and it'll be on environmental justice. So thank you again for speaking with us today, and thank you to Metropolitan Community College for hosting, and then thank you to all of our viewers for attending. We hope to see you again next month. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.